Okay, I'm going to go over very briefly how to install tinyAgent and how to get it up and running. There's a bunch of documentation on the GitHub and the site, and I'll keep updating that. But for now, the simplest way is to just do a pip install. Once you do that, you'll have the essential package. If you want to go and read the entire code base or you want to go and look at it in more detail, you can go here and it has everything open source. But what you need initially is just the core package, which is via the pip library. Once you do that, you'll have access to all the tooling and whatnot. And you're going to need an API key from OpenRouter. And just with the OpenRouter API key, you'll pretty much be set. I have a couple of examples in the documentation on the configurations. So you just need a config file and a environment file, obviously. And you can just copy paste these commands here to go and get the examples. It's pretty simple. Once you get that set up, you can take a look in there. You can configure some stuff like the models, the amount of times you're going to retry an example, tooling limits, etc., etc. That's all covered in documentation. But at the simplest level, it's all about creating the tool and handing it off to the agent. So here we import the decorator, import what I call the factory, which I'll go into more detail later. But you define your tool with just like a simple decorator. Then you pass it off to the agent. And with the agent, you just say, hey, here's your tool. And I added something that says, hey, I'm expecting a number. With the configuration file, you can set up to where if you want a structured output, the models that support it will have it on by default. Or you can just handle straight up JSON from any LLM. And I go into more detail in that in documentation, and I'll go through that stuff later as well. But essentially, it'll work out of the box with any LLM, with any function, structured output thing that you're working with. It should work. And there's a bunch of JSON parsing and whatnot that I've made. But at the simplest level, I'm just using these structured outputs from models to support it, like DeepSeek V3, which is what I'm using now. And a lot of the big ones support that already. So, and again, it's all labeled in documentation, but what I have here is a tool, and a tool is just simple as a function, arguments, return. That's all you need to make a tool of tinyAgent. You define it with a decorator, and you pass it off to the agent. And there's a bunch of configs, like I mentioned. You can go and check that out in documentation. You run that with the query, and you'll get the raw result if you want to. Or you can also say, hey, I want the entire thing with the configuration. Here I'm expecting an integer, but you can set that up to be a JSON, text, string, whatever you want. And I'm going to set up something that will let you essentially define your output schema as you see fit. Still working on that, but let me just run this example really quickly. And then I got a dip. So what you'll do once you define your tooling and your agents, you'll run that. And I have a bunch of logs here just to show what's going to happen. But this will all be removed. And you can remove this from the debug or the logs in the configuration file, right? So I ran it here, and you'll see I have a proxy as well. You don't need to use a proxy, but if you're going to do a lot of web scraping, web browsing, you're probably going to want to have that activated. Then I have here basically the configurations for the agent. Again, you can look at the documentation. It's very detailed. But at the lowest level, we're just saying, hey, I have the structured outputs enabled, passing the schema, and then here's the tool, here's the arguments, here's the result, which is 8 in this case, and the type that I was expecting, which is integer, so that's correct. But that's a very basic idea. You handle the tooling yourself via a function decorator, pass it to the agent, and your agent takes care of the rest. Now, the second layer of this would be the orchestrator, and that's essentially you're passing a query to tinyAgent, and you're saying, hey, here's all my tools, here's your query, go ahead and just figure it out as best you can. And again, documentation goes over how to limit that, how to, if you want to go basically YOLO mode and say, hey, you have 100 calls, do whatever it takes to get there. You'll be able to do that as well. That's still in very early beta, still very rough, but I have a ton of examples in the cookbook. I want to say over 10 examples now. For example, just the very basic function agent, which is what I just showed. A basic agent that does some like knowledge work, quote unquote, trying to find keywords. The factory agent, which shows in more detail how the factory works. The decorator agent, you get the idea, right? Just a decorator. I have a text browser that I've made. You can manipulate files. You can do deep research, quote unquote. I have an example of the orchestrator, which is just all this right here is basically a fancy configuration, and then passing the query, which is research the latest U.S. tariffs, create a comprehensive markdown summary file called tariff summary MD, right? And that uses, it should use all the internal tools that I've built out for it. I'm gonna have that expanded as well, but for now, that's still in very early, rough beta. But the tooling works 100%, especially if you're using structured outputs. If you want to use your own model, I also have that supported. So if you just go to the configuration file that I have in the documentation, which is here, you can set up the base URL to be a localhost. And then here you just pass the name of the model, and you can pretty much handle any model that uses the OpenAI API library. And if you wanted to, you can kind of sort of hack it to pretty much, as long as you're passing JSON, that's all that matters. And all that stuff is configurable here, from the temperatures to the amount of retries, et cetera, et cetera. So check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, either open up a PR or just leave a comment and I'll see what I can do.